With that, we can move on to the next passage. Over the past 4 centuries, oh, wait, first we need to go back over the questions and ask ourselves whether we want to do this or not. So the author of the passage refers to the Davos elite to illustrate his views on. Now, if I have a little general awareness, I know Davos is the place where the economic, let us say, summit happens every year. So the Davos elite are those people who are in some sense the ones who actually benefit greatly and contribute greatly to the summit. Okay, so that means we are looking at some politico-economic kind of scenario here. Okay, then all of the following statements are evidence of decline of liberalism today, which means again we're looking at a socio-economic scenario. The author of the passage faults Denen's conclusions for all of the following reasons. We don't know that. We haven't read Denen yet. And the author of the passage is very likely to disagree with all the following statements. Now, we don't know anything from 11 and 12, but we do know from 9 and 10 that we are actually going to be discussing socio-political thought with reference to, let us say, economic thought. Now, if I'm not comfortable with that kind of area, if I'm not comfortable with, let's say, socio-economic concepts or the kind of schools of thought that we're looking at, liberalism, for instance, I'm not too comfortable with the word, then I'm going to have to spend time in the passage trying to figure out what the word means. So, if I haven't done that kind of reading, maybe I leave this passage for later. But if I have done some kind of reading and liberalism and socio-economic thought is not foreign to me, then I would take it up. So, do remember, your level of comfort here depends on whether from your little understanding of those two questions, whether you think you are going to be familiar with the kind of concepts they are going to discuss, liberalism, socio-economic concepts, Davos and what happens there. If I haven't any idea about that, I'll say, okay, I'll handle this later. But if I have done some reading and I can pick it up, then I'll probably try this now. Okay, so let's have a look at the passage itself. Over the past 4 centuries, liberalism has been so successful. What is liberalism basically? This whole business of let's be tolerant, let us allow, let us say, economics or economic progress without regulation. Let us allow people to function without regulation, basically, or with minimal regulation. So, over the past 4 centuries, liberalism has been so successful that it has driven all its opponents off the battlefield, which means as a school of thought, this whole business of let us be more tolerant of people and allow them to function the way they want to function has taken off authoritarianism, dictatorship, all of in that sense, I mean economic. Now it is disintegrating, destroyed by a mix of hubris and internal contradictions. That means this very idea of let us not regulate is actually causing problems. And it was so proud of itself as being the one ideology that works, that the sheer pride is bringing it down. The belief that nothing else works is actually bringing it down. And internal contradictions, that means it's not even very clear about certain things within its own ideologies. So it's disintegrating, according to Patrick Deneen, a professor of politics at University of Notre Dame. So he believes that this is what's happening to liberalism. It's been very successful, so it's become very proud, but it's always had contradictions, and now people are starting to question it. Disintegrating would mean that people are starting to question that ideology as being the one ideology that actually we should follow. So equality of opportunity has produced a new meritocratic aristocracy that has all the aloofness of the old aristocracy, with none of its sense of noblesse oblige, which means we were liberal, we thought we brought about equality, we thought we made everything available to everyone who has merit, but thanks to that, people who have merit have come up, but they seem to have become snooty, they seem to have become, let's say, arrogant, very much like the old aristocrats were, and without a sense of noblesse oblige. Now this I need to understand. Noblesse oblige is a French term which means the superiors in society do have some, let's say, some responsibility or some duty of actually being gracious towards their inferiors. That was noblesse oblige. Noblesse oblige, aristocrats need to be gracious towards their subordinates. There's a certain duty, very much like managers need to pay attention to their team members. It's like that. So noblesse oblige. So what this person is saying is, old aristocrats at least believed that their superiority gave them some responsibility of taking care of the ones who worked for them, whereas the new aristocrats, the ones who actually have come up through their merit, have reached a certain elite status, and they now consider themselves to be elite without the kind of thinking that tolerant or responsible thinking that the old aristocrats seem to have had. So that's what the problem here is, that thanks to this liberalism, equality of opportunity has produced a new meritocratic aristocracy that is not very different from the old. They also consider themselves to be unique, but they don't have that sense of responsibility that the old aristocracy had. Okay, so democracy has degenerated into a theatre of the absurd. So you realize that even democracy has so many contradictions within it. That's why the theatre of the absurd. And technological advances are reducing ever more areas of work into meaningless drudgery. So thanks to this liberal thinking of let us allow without regulation, we've come up with technological advancements where people now don't even take satisfaction in their work. The gap between liberalism's claims about itself and the lived reality of the citizenry is now so wide that the lie can no longer be accepted, which means it's disintegrating. That means the belief in liberalism is actually coming down. All right? So this is what Mr. Deneen writes. What better proof of this than the vision of 1,000 private planes whisking their occupants to Davos to discuss the question of creating a shared future in a fragmented world? In other words, to understand this whole business of new meritocratic aristocracy coming down to the aloofness of the old aristocracy is, and not even with a sense of obligation towards, let's say, those who are less advantaged. What better way of demonstrating that when you say that people coming to Davos, that economic forum, all come in their own private planes, 1,000 private planes, visiting this to discuss what? To discuss creating a shared future in a fragmented world. Shared future by whom? Shared future by the wealthy. Shared future by the people who are actually at the top of the ladder. So what better way of demonstrating the truth of this meaningless, let's say, liberalism than this? So he gives you Davos as an example of that. Deneen does an impressive job of capturing the current mood of disillusionment, echoing left-wing complaints about rampant commercialism, right-wing complaints about narcissistic and bullying students, and general worries about atomization and selfishness. In other words, he says, Deneen actually picks all the right areas in society to tell you this is what is happening. One is, left-wing are complaining about the fact that there's rising inequality, and there's rampant commercialism, which means that is going to prompt more inequality. The right-wing guys complain about the fact that students are trying to push, let us say, left-wing ideas, and general worries about atomization and selfishness. And everyone is worried about the fact that people don't think about others. But when he concludes that all this adds up to a failure of liberalism, is his argument convincing? So now we've heard Deneen's argument, but now the author is saying, is this a convincing argument? Let's consider that. He argues that the essence of liberalism lies in freeing individuals from constraints. That's what Deneen says. He says, liberalism is about freeing individuals from constraints, that means having no regulation, and that's what's caused the problem. In fact, liberalism contains a wide range of intellectual traditions which provide different answers to the question of how to trade off the relative claims of rights and responsibilities. In other words, liberalism, the author says, liberalism does not remove all constraints. Liberalism is, let's find a balance. To trade off would mean to find a balance. Let's find a balance between all sides. To actually recognize that everyone has some claims and some responsibilities, so there must be some amount of regulation. So liberalism doesn't say no regulation. Deneen believes that liberalism says no regulation, but the author says actually liberalism actually is about finding a balance, right? And to trade off the relative claims of rights and responsibilities, individual expression and social ties. That liberalism experimented with a range of ideas from devolving power from the center to creating national education systems. Now it is because liberalism talked about finding a balance, it actually gave rise to, let's say, distribution of powers politically, and looking at providing something that generates certain amount of equality. That's because they were looking at a balance, right? Because they were looking at a balance, they said, let us allow people to progress, but let us also regulate and ensure that they do get an opportunity to exercise, let's say, their authority, and they do also get an opportunity to achieve at least some kind of equality. So the author's view is that Deneen had the wrong idea of liberalism. He believed that you actually free people from all kinds of regulation, and that's what's caused the problem that we have today. But the author says actually liberalism always looked at finding the right kind of balance. Okay, so now that we've understood the questions, the author of the passage refers to Davos alike to illustrate what? To illustrate his views on his views or Deneen's views. He says Deneen has views, but here's an example of those views. Is it the unlikelihood of a return of liberalism of the past as long as the rich continue to benefit? No, that's not what he's saying. He's not saying that we might not get to what we had earlier. He's saying this is evidence of something. It's evidence of what? It's evidence of the fact that people who've become rich are now considering themselves to be unique. And they only are talking about the world being divided into bits that they can use for themselves. Okay. The fact that the rise in liberalism has led to a greater interest in shared futures from the unlikely social classes? From the unlikely social classes? No, greater interest in shared futures for themselves from social classes that are actually on the top of the scale. So it's not true either. The hypocrisy of the liberal rich who profess to subscribe to liberal values while cornering most of the wealth. Who profess to subscribe to liberal values as in make things free, don't regulate, then everyone has opportunities. But they are the ones who have actually cornered most of the opportunity and all the wealth, and that's demonstrated by the fact that their visits to Davos is all in their own private planes. So yeah, it is actually to demonstrate three. It's illustrate, no? So to demonstrate the truth of that statement, or Denon's statement, he gives you Davos's allies. Then Davos's elite. The way to debate around liberalism has been captured by the rich who have managed to insulate themselves from economic hardships. The way to debate around liberalism. No, they claim to be liberal. They are not saying they are not liberal. They claim to be liberal, but their behavior tells you that they become an aristocratic elite themselves who don't really worry about other people. So Denon's thought has been illustrated by the Davosite. That's what the author says. He's presenting the Davosite as an example of Denon's thought. So 3 then is the answer to 9. What about 10? Now, all of the following statements are evidence of the decline of liberalism today, except that means he's telling you that liberalism is no longer as holy a cow as it was considered to be. And we know that's because work has become drudgery. We know that's because inequality is still rising. And we know that's because the super wealthy are not really, in some sense, concerned too much about the ones who don't have advantages. So, we are looking at the exception here. And technological advances are reducing ever more areas of work into meaningless drudgery. But actually, is that about liberalism or is it about technological advancements? We just hold it there. We are looking at the exception, right? Now, the gap between liberalism claims about itself and lived reality is so wide that can no longer be accepted. Exactly. Which means we claim to bring about equality, but what the truth really is that we are actually looking at rising inequality. And you can't quite accept that. Yes, so that is something that we know is evidence. Democracy has degenerated into the theatre of the absurd. Now, these are statements. We are saying all of the following are statements which are evidence. So, yes, democracy has a lot of internal contradictions. So, that is also something that we accept. And the creation of business aristocracy, the rise of vast companies, which means these guys have become the new aristocrats. And therefore, again, inequality. And therefore, again, it is actually evidence that we are not really truly, the claims of liberalism are not being met. So, that is a decline also in terms of the claims. So, we will accept 2, 3 and 4 as evidence of decline. Now, we did consider 1 because the person does say that. He actually says here, but you have to ask yourself, is it actually evidence of decline? What he's really saying is that it's disintegrating. Democracy has degenerated into this theatre of absurd. And technological advances are reducing ever more areas of work into meaningless drudgery. The gap between, so all these statements, you realize this one is about internal contradictions in liberal democracy. This one is about the fact that inequality is existing. And this one is, let us say, you can't accept it. Now, we do have something else. We do have this business of meaningless drudgery. But the point is, this is about technological advances. This is not about liberalism. So, if we go back to that, we would actually ask ourselves, so 1, and the creation of business aristocracy, the rise of vast companies, have we got that statement there? Because if you look at that, he's actually saying over here, the rise of vast companies, right? So, moving on, Mr. Denon's fixation on the essence of liberalism leads to the second big problem of his book. His failure to recognize liberalism's ability to reform itself and address its internal problems. That means that is also what he's saying. He says that they can't. First is the author says that Denon had a problem with the definition of liberalism. Whereas Denon believes liberalism is total absence of regulation. Actually, liberalism allows for a balance between regulation and freedom. Okay. Now, the second problem is obviously liberalism does have the ability to reform itself, address its internal problems, and he doesn't see that. He doesn't believe that it has that, or he hasn't even considered the possibility that things could be corrected. So, the late 19th century saw America suffering from many of the problems that are reappearing today, including the creation of a business aristocracy, the rise of vast companies. Now, a business aristocracy would be a line that goes back to what we talked earlier, no? Which is that thanks to merit, people are becoming elite, and they don't even have the, let us say, the social responsibility of the old aristocracy. And the business aristocracy is the rise of vast companies. Okay, the corruption of politics and the sense that society was dividing into winners and losers. This happened in the late 19th century. But a wide variety of reformers working within the liberal tradition tackled these problems head on. Theodore Roosevelt took on the trusts. That means he actually brought down those who thought they were financially important. Progressives cleaned up government corruption. University reformers modernized academic syllabuses and built ladders of opportunity. Rather than dying, liberalism reformed itself, which means liberalism does have within itself the capacity of reformation, and that is what this man did not see in his book. Mr. Denon is right to point out that the record of liberalism in recent years has been dismal. That is true. He is also right to assert that the world has much to learn from the pre-modern notions of liberty as self-mastery and self-denial. That is also true, considering that it happened in the 19th century. The biggest enemy of liberalism is not so much atomization, not so much selfishness, but old-fashioned greed. Just the fact that we need to accumulate for ourselves. As members of the Davos elite, pile their plates ever higher with perks and share options. So all these corporate aristocracy are simply making themselves richer and richer, right? But he is wrong to argue that the only way for people to liberate themselves from the contradictions of liberalism is liberation from liberalism itself. In other words, Denon says, let's dump the ideology. And the author says he's wrong in doing that because liberalism can actually correct itself. So the best way to read Denon's book, Why Liberalism Failed, is not as a funeral oration, not as something that says it's now dead, but as a call to up your game or else. So what we should look at it as, just as people did in the 19th century, correct? We need to start doing that now, or else. Or else we might lead to a point where liberalism actually has to be dumped. So he says, Denon did not actually consider the fact that it can correct itself. So he says we should dump it. But the truth really is, according to the author, what we should really look at Denon's book as is a clarion call. Wake up, start reforming yourself the way it had happened earlier. But if you don't, then maybe you're going to lead to a total collapse of this ideology. So that's the passage over here. Now let's look at the questions we have. The author of the passage refers to the Davos elite to illustrate who? He refers in two places. One is he talks about the fact that they all arrive in these super rich all arrive in their private planes. But he also refers to them again over here to say that, over here, where he talks about Davos, that members of Davos elite pile their plates higher and higher with perks and share options. They keep kind of feeding themselves, not bothering too much about the people less advantaged than them. So it is to do what then? He refers to the Davos elite to illustrate his views on the unlikelihood of a return to the liberalism of the past. No, he says maybe we can correct liberalism. And we can actually, in some sense, bring about reform. So he's not saying it's Denon who thinks. It's Denon who thinks it's unlikely, not the author. Now, the author is referring to the Davos elite. Is he saying the fact that the rise has only led to greater interest in shared futures? Well, we'll hold on to that. But is it about the hypocrisy of the liberal rich who profess to actually subscribe to liberal values, namely let's bring about equality, while cornering most of the wealth, while piling their plates with perks and their own wealth and building assets for themselves and sharing the world amongst themselves, right? They claim to be liberal and interested in the overall equality of, let's say, society, but they are not. The truth really is they're not doing that. Therefore, they are hypocrites. Quite right. So 3 is better than 2. Then what about 4? The way the debate around liberalism has been captured by the rich? Are we saying that the debate the whole business of being liberal is something that only the rich profess to? They've been captured by it? who managed to insulate themselves from economic hardships, this part is not discussed. We are not saying they are insulating themselves. We are saying they are not bothering about the others. They are not actually passing on benefits. They are just accumulating things for themselves. So it's more about the accumulation part, cornering most of the wealth that we are talking about. So 3 then is the answer in 9. Okay. What about 10? All the following statements are evidence of the decline of liberalism today except. That means statements made in the passage, right? Statements made in the passage which tell you that liberalism is no longer what it used to be. Now, so one statement is technological advances are reducing ever more areas of work into meaningless drudgery. By itself, that statement only talks about technological advances. Right. We'll come back to it. The gap between liberalism's claims about itself and the lived reality, which means they claimed to bring about equality, but the reality is that they did not, is now so wide that the like can no longer be accepted. Now, that's evidence of the decline. And then democracy has degenerated to theatre of the absurd with so many contradictions that it has, right? As happened in the 19th century, but was reformed, but is happening again. So, yes, there's a decline. And the creation of a business aristocracy, the rise of vast companies, again, the fact of business aristocracy who don't even have the, let us say, the social graces that the earlier aristocracy had in wanting to, in some sense, feeling a sense of responsibility towards the poor, is not even there. And therefore, that is also evidence of the decline. So, this is only technological advance. This is not the fact that work has become meaningless drudgery because of liberalism. It is work has become meaningless drudgery because we have actually made advances in technology that allow this to happen. So, literally 2, 3 and 4 are evidence that, that liberalism and liberal democracy no longer very relevant, but 1 is not. So, 1 is the exception to this question. What about 11? The author of the passage faults Denin's conclusions for all of the following reasons except. 1 is he says Denin has got the wrong definition of liberal democracy. 2 is he says that he doesn't believe that liberalism, or he doesn't consider the fact that liberalism can correct itself. So, we need the exception here. 3 of them actually are Denin's problems according to the author, 1 is not. So, the extreme pessimism about the future of liberalism today and predictions of an ultimate decline. Now, predictions about an ultimate decline. Is he faulting his conclusion for that? To fault someone's conclusions, you have to talk about the reasons. Why do you have very wrong reasons? So, you're not saying, you're not faulting the conclusion for the conclusion itself. See, I don't fault a conclusion for what the conclusion is. I fault a conclusion for why the conclusion was arrived at or how it was arrived. That's basically what reasoning is, no? You don't disagree with the person because you don't agree with them. You disagree with the person because you don't agree with their reasons. See, if you give me an opinion or a conclusion and I say I don't agree with it, it's not that I don't agree with your conclusion per se, I don't agree with your reasons for your conclusion. Now, 1 is the conclusion itself. The extreme pessimism is the conclusion itself, it's not the reason for it. So, if the others give me reasons, I look at those. It's very narrow definition of liberalism, exactly. He says one of the reasons for faulting the conclusion is that you've not looked at liberalism in its true sense. You've not looked at it as balance, you've only looked at it as freedom from all regulation. So, yes, this is one of the reasons. And then it's repeated harking back to pre-modern notions of liberty. That means going back to saying liberty is what it was, we will never get back to that. Whereas the author says we might get back to that if we actually correct ourselves. So, if you say that this repeated harking back, now, is he faulting it for going back all the time, or is he faulting it for not looking at the possibility of correction? So, its failure to note historical instances in which the process of declining liberalism, okay. So, we know that 2 and 4 we will look at, but between 1 and 2, 1 is its extreme pessimism about the future of liberalism today. Now, the point is, the future of liberalism today, he says, is actually that it's going down, it's declining, and predictions of an ultimate decline. So, he has made that statement, but he's made that statement with extreme pessimism, believing that there is no way of correction. The point is, one of the reasons that he faults his conclusion is that you think there's going to be no way of correction. Whereas 3, it's repeated harking back to pre-modern notions of society. He's not faulting it for that. He's not faulting it for saying that you keep talking about that. He's faulting it for saying that he's faulting his conclusion he's faulting the Denon for saying that you are saying that liberalism is coming down, but you're not willing to look at the possibility that could correct itself, and you believe that there's no hope left, but there is hope left. So in other words, it's not about 3. We do accept 1, but 3 is not the reason that he's faulting the conclusion. He's not saying you're wrong to keep going back to the pre-modern notions. He's saying you're wrong to believe that those ideas cannot be brought back, which means 3 is the exception here. So 1, 2 and 4 we'd accept, but not 3. So that would be 11 for you. And what about 12? The author of the passage is likely to disagree with all of the following statements except. That means 3 things here he says, 1 he does not. Or 3 things here we can understand from what he says, but 1 not. Liberalism was the dominant ideal in the past century, but it had to reform itself to remain so. It had to reform itself to remain so, but we are now questioning it. If it says to remain so, that means it's still the dominant ideal, whereas now we realize it's disintegrating. So if you say the author is likely to disagree with all of the following statements except, now the point is, if you say liberalism was the dominant ideal in the past century, but to come back to a sense of correctness, it had to course correct and actually get reformed. So he is possibly going to agree with that. He's going to agree. He's actually saying here that the late 19th century saw it with many problems, but they cleaned up, etc., and it reformed itself. So which means rather than dying, it reformed itself. So it remained in some sense a significant ideology. So we know that he is not going to disagree with this. This is probably something that's more in the line of his thinking. If we accept that liberalism is dying, we must work to find a viable substitute. No, he's not going to disagree with that. He's saying if we accept that liberalism is dying, then we need to do something about it. We need to reform it. So he's not going to agree, he's certainly going to disagree with this. The claims about liberalism disintegration are exaggerated and misunderstood to its core features. He's going to disagree with that also, because when he says claims about liberalism disintegration are exaggerated, right, he says maybe that's true, maybe it is declining, and misunderstand its core features. Now, we misunderstand its core features. He's actually going to, if you're going to say that, he says that he would not agree with. He might agree with the fact that claims are exaggerated, but he's not going to agree with we misunderstand its core features, because he says we know its core features actually contain the capacity to correct itself. So he's going to disagree with this also. The essence of liberalism lies in greater individual self-expression and freedom. No. He believes the essence of liberalism is in actually finding a balance. Is finding a balance between self-expression and, let us say, outcome. So he's going to disagree with this also. So what he's not going to disagree with is 1, because he says yes, it was dominant, it did start to slide, but they did course correct and bring about reforms to bring it back to even keel. So 1 therefore is going to be the exception. 2, 3 and 4 are actually statements that the author would disagree with. So that's this passage for you. Now this, as I said, was a passage that you would have taken up if you believed you were a little familiar with political ideology, economic ideology, socio-political terms. Then handling this would not have been difficult. Otherwise, you would possibly have left it to try after you tried things more that you find more comfortable.